The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar on Digital Preservation, Audiovisual Edition, Part 2. I am Amanda Stone, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. I will be your host for today's webinar. Our presenter today is Stefan El-Nabli at the University of California, San Diego Library. Stefan El-Nabli is the library's media curation librarian and manager of digital reformatting operations, providing strategic direction in the library's management, preservation, and access of moving image collections, both analog and digital. Stefan's engagement with visual culture and digital repository development spans the areas of cinema studies, archival preservation, and repository service management. A few logistics for today's presentation. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise, and we do not have interactive chat capabilities. You may, however, comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is ALCTSCE. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so if you have questions for the presenter, please type them into the question box on your screen. We will have time for Q&A after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides shortly after the presentation concludes. And now, here's Stefan. There will be a slight delay as we change presenters.
Thank you, Amanda, and welcome everybody to this ALCTS webinar series entitled Digital Preservation Audiovisual Edition. So just to kind of recap the description of the webinar series, it started out as a two-part series, and it's dedicated to the discussion of audio and video materials in a digital preservation context. From analog media, digitally reformatted, to born digital audiovisual materials. This webinar series covers basics of understanding audiovisual media and how to consider these materials when engaged in preservation and access at your library or archive. So the first part of the webinar series covered things like characteristics of AV media, whether that was video, audio, or film. Audio specifically related to how it's incorporated in video or film. So this edition covers practical applications of digital preservation methodologies to audiovisual materials, as well as considerations for born digital video in a digital preservation context. So we'll talk a little bit about practical examples and real life scenarios. And at the end of this section, we'll touch upon what constitutes an archive of born digital AV, how a library or archive can curate and steward born digital AV collections for preservation and access, and how archiving born digital audiovisual materials as well as digitized audiovisual materials can be practical at your university or library or archive. So I just want to recap a little bit about my experience and my role here at UC San Diego. So I'm the media curation librarian, where I also supervise our image, text, and audiovisual reformatting operations. So functionally speaking, I have a split assignment, and I serve in our collection development and management program, as well as our digital library development program. So this means that I have my hands involved in the full life cycle of media objects in the library, from collection development and management to digital library endeavors like preservation and repository services. So this is an interesting place to be, because I'm kind of dynamically kind of interdisciplinary, where I'm involved in the full life cycle of media objects, from before they come into the library, through acquisition, through their management, through their reformatting and their preservation and their access. So having said that, I wanted to also stress that This presentation will also factor in not just archival audiovisual materials and born digital materials, but the types of resources that might be acquired for your users through through regular acquisitions departments for collections. So we're not going to focus necessarily and only on archival special collections type material, even though that's part of it. So here is our schedule at a glance. I'm going to speak about the context of digital preservation as it relates to audiovisual materials, both analog and born digital, and provide kind of an introduction to the issues that we face on a day-to-day basis with that type of material and in that kind of context. We'll speak about digital archiving and preservation. What is it? What does that entail? How does it relate to media? And then we'll drill down a little bit more into considerations for audiovisual media in that context. And then I'll discuss a couple different case studies. One, a VHS migration project that we're engaged with here at UC San Diego. And I understand that that is a hot topic among a lot of libraries who are dealing with their VHS collections, not necessarily in a special collections context, but also their circulating video collections. What do you do? And then also I'll discuss a born digital preservation case study where we're aligned with a campus unit who delivers born digital media to our library that we have to describe and preserve. Okay, moving on. So, some of the basic questions that we're going to be asking today include things like, what is a digital archive? What's the difference between born digital and digitized AV? If something is digital, is it already preserved? Is the digital archiving process different from managing analog collections? And how can I start digital archiving program for my AV? The proliferation of born digital media is endless and rapid, and we've experienced this over the course of many years as we continue into a world that's more digital. Modern archives are collecting, archiving, and preserving audiovisual files of many different flavors, and this type of archiving comes with its own set of considerations. So, where do we start? The questions that I outlined at the beginning of this slide are some of the places where we would want to start when we think about the issues present. Digital asset management is a product of sound archiving foundation. Digital asset management also incorporates managing digitized materials. The principles of digital archiving influence the types of systems and software that you create, and also the systems that you use to manage audiovisual material. And all of these things should include an emphasis on preservation services, which are sometimes not the same as asset management. And I'll illustrate an example of this when I talk about UC San Diego's relationship to the University of California's UC-TV, which is a production arm of UC that produces content for online and broadcast delivery. So, what is born digital? The top definition here, relating to or noting documents, images, etc., that are created and managed in electronic form, comes from an online English dictionary source. And it's also humorous to me that their sentence is using the word in context. Is this: as research libraries are discovering born digital materials, they're more complicated and costly to preserve than anticipated. So some examples of born digital media include things like cameras that are recording to file formats on solid state drives or removable media like a Panasonic B2 card, computers, cell phones, tablets, floppy disks, optical media like CDs, DVDs, and Blu-rays. Whether it's born digital as a file that comes to you on a hard drive or some other kind of digital storage medium, born digital can also come on physical carriers like digital video tape, DV tape, for example. Some examples at UC San Diego. We have, in the last 2 years, our library has increased its attention to born digital archiving in all realms and formats. And our digital archivist, who works between the Digital Library Development Program and our special collections, has a lot of interaction with these materials in a special collections context. Whereas I will mainly deal with reformatted analog materials, but also media acquisitions that come into the library in digital form. So for example, digital collections we have that are required for preservation or access can come in the form of files or optical discs or data tape, content generated by campus partners such as UCTV, and licensed audio and video for general circulating collections, which is an issue that's becoming being more and more visible. A lot of the time people are struggling with this idea of streaming video and whether or not they should be acquiring physical optical media to be able to loan to their users. But distributors now are either offering digital site licenses so that you can use their platforms to stream, or they might not even have a platform to stream something, and they will give you a digital file. And that digital file can be hosted at your university through some kind of streaming mechanism, or in some cases, people will actually create DVDs out of the digital file. And we'll talk a little bit about what might be the best route, whether taking a digital file and putting it in a physical format defeats the purpose of long-term preservation or not, or is essential for access. So how is born digital media different from digitization? Is a file that's digitized from an analog carrier supposed to be treated differently than a born digital file? Perhaps in a preservation context, one might say no. However, preservation requires an attention to original order and provenance, which includes attention to the significant characteristics of digital files. So on the one hand, you have a digital surrogate that's trying to capture the significant characteristics of the original analog media, and on the other hand, you have an original file in itself with its own series of significant characteristics. However, reading the quote here, because at the end of the day, archiving all of these types of files requires treating them in the same context, which essentially is preservation. So in the realm of digitization, as you can see here in the slide, what you're doing is you're changing an analog signal into binary form, whereas born digital comes as a file and is created digitally from the point of creation. In the first part of the series, we delved more into what types of digitization is available for audiovisual material and what kind of characteristics to pay attention to. As we move on in this part of the webinar series, we're going to talk about how to manage those files and what to pay attention to in terms of preservation. So how is this important to libraries and archives? Digital asset management is a product of sound archiving foundation. The principles of digital archiving influence development of systems, and you have to know about properties of digital audio and video, as well as the archiving process to improve your workflows. Essentially, all of this helps to strengthen communication between the archive, the library, and content producers and acquisitions. I wanted to shift to a poll just to get a read on what folks are doing here in terms of audiovisual digitization, also born digital collections, and preservation policy. So why don't we shift to our first poll? We'll take a look at the results and we'll talk about them in context. That's great. Okay, so this is almost consistent with the poll that I conducted in the first part of the webinar series. My assumption is that those of you who were present at the first one are also present in the second one, but if not, this is also really good. This is digitization of audiovisual material is always the first step to preservation. So we can move to the next poll question. Okay, also an overwhelming yes. This, to me, is evidence that we're all contending with the issues of born digital collections and not only digitized media collections. So we can move to the next question. Do you have a digital preservation policy for your audiovisual media? All right, looks like we're pretty much split here. We've got 46% who say yes, and 34% no, and some I don't know. So hopefully by the end of this part of the webinar series, you'll be able to see what considerations will influence what a policy might look like and what you might want to consider when implementing some kind of audiovisual preservation program, both for analog digitized materials, but also born digital media. So we'll go with the last question, which is almost complementary, which is, do you have a repository with digital preservation services? All right, so I'm seeing more than half say yes, which is great. So I want to also reiterate that a repository in itself can be perhaps a software as a service where you're actually using a vendor-based product, or it could be homespun. But what we want to focus on is whether that system that's used to manage assets has what we call preservation services. And when we talk about the digital archiving process and what considerations must be made in a preservation context, we'll talk a little bit about what those services are, because they will influence what your policies are that will govern audiovisual materials in the archiving and preservation process. So moving on, we're going to go to our first section, digital archiving and preservation, to take a look at what does the process entail, and then we're going to drill down into audiovisual characteristics and how that overlaps. So in context, how can we consider an archive of digital media? What does it mean to have a digital archive? So essentially, it's a collection of digital files or objects. Objects can be born digital or can be digital surrogates in the case of digitized analog materials. And these things are actively maintained for preservation and access purposes. The preservation process, I'd argue, always starts at the point of either acquisition or creation. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later on. Now, if you want to drill down into the concept of preservation, it's more than just putting a hard drive on a shelf. It's more than a backup of your computer, and it's more than a networked drive. When we talk about services in the archiving and preservation process, you'll understand that preservation is not just backups and copies, but it's active management. Additionally, and it was great to see that there are institutions who consider policy to be important when we saw the results of the poll. But having a specific and public collection development policy that addresses born digital material as well as digitized material will help direct what you collect and how you make it available. We're going to discuss the concept of digital objects and metadata. Metadata essentially makes the management of files a lot easier, and it is really quite essential to a preservation system. And when we talk about metadata, we're talking about information about the files, whether that's descriptive, technical, or preservation related, and we'll drill down into that a little bit later. Within an archiving and preservation system, we have to keep our mind open toward file formats that are open and have less barriers to preservation, that aren't dependent upon things like software and hardware components, that aren't proprietary. And I provided a couple links, so when you get your slides for this presentation, you can refer to them. Another aspect of a digital archiving and preservation system is file naming. And it relates to this idea of file normalization. It's not necessarily the case that you always want to keep every file in the same format, but you do want to consider what formats are appropriate for archiving and what formats are appropriate for access. And you want to be mindful of file naming schema so that you have more intellectual control over those files, and that relates to this concept of metadata. So it's always important to have a useful file naming system that incorporates unique IDs, location pointers, and anything else that would help future professionals to understand what's contained in the files when you might not be around to tell them. So the archiving and preservation process kind of revolves around this concept of an open archival information system, which is an ISO standard. So let's take a look at what this is real quick and identify it as a model. So OIAS refers to the reference model for an open archival information system, and it's generic. It's generic for a reason. A producer, as you can see on the left, submits data to a repository, which is then managed and disseminated to a consumer of information, who you could see on the right. And it's very generic purposefully because it functions as a model to help define terminology and concepts that are integral to the foundation of a trusted digital repository. It's not simply a prescription of what you do, but it's the basis for allowing you to test the assertion that these things, and in this case media, whatever it may be, are being preserved. This is a process that the archive must manage closely, or the library, where relationships are established with content producers on the left, whether those producers are considered the people digitizing material or the people acquiring born digital material. And it also incorporates this concept of submission information packages, which adhere to a set of requirements made by repository managers. So as we drill down closer into considerations for audiovisual material, we'll start to understand what is it that we want to keep with our files, specifically metadata. How do we wrap those things into an object that can be preserved, that can be persistent, and that can be accessible in the future? And we need to be cognizant of how we can contribute and affect those requirements and repository functions. So you can see when I said that preservation always starts at the point of creation or acquisition, it's very important to recognize the importance of the producer and what they're providing to the archive, because as it's delivered and managed, it can transform into a variety of different things that are useful to managers, administrators, different people within your library, but also consumers of that information, who will only see perhaps on a small portion of everything that was submitted to your archive. All of these things contribute to this idea of having intellectual control over your collections, having controlled metadata, ensuring access over time, and making sure that you understand rights and provenance information that's related to those files. So just a quick recap related to the first part of this webinar series, and in context now here in the archiving and preservation process. Digitization specifically is a process of an analog signal being changed into a binary data, whereas in digital preservation of born digital material, you might do something what's called disk imaging that creates a file containing the contents and structure of a disk or a volume. And it's not always the case that when you get born digital media that contains AV, that you would want to save it as a disk image. You might want to actually access the video files and extract them, because it's not always the case that you want to preserve the entire file system. That would depend on what your policies are and in what context you're preserving audiovisual material. So a little bit more about that digital archiving process, more specifically, this idea of creating disk images is essentially the idea of stabilizing media in order to image it, or as I said in a different context, perhaps extracting it. And all of it relates to these concepts of characterization, compliance, ingest, and delivery. So at a top level, let's just take a look at the archiving and preservation process and what influences how we create systems and policies. So essentially, you have a collection of digital files or objects that you want to actively maintain for preservation and access. You'd ideally want to have a specific collection development policy or a preservation policy to guide your work, and consider things like open file formats and normalization of files so that you can more easily manage these things over time. And we'll talk a little bit about sustainability factors in the coming slides. File naming systems and policies revolving around that contributes to intellectual control. And in a preservation context, you always want to consider dispersed storage and fixity checking. And when we speak about fixity, we're talking about checksums that are essentially kind of like the sum total of all the data that's unique. So if a file changes over time, then your checksum will be different. You'll know that your file is invalid. And also, one wants to consider it in archival context, security and auditing, access control, personally identifiable information, and things like how to measure the functions of a trusted digital repository. So, for example, all of these things kind of contribute to how we deal with issues that arise. This is an example of a hard drive that I worked with that contained video files. On the left, you see the same video file as the one on the right, however, it is corrupt somehow. Essentially what happened was we had video cameras that recorded video to these P2 and backed them up on 2 hard drives. So seemingly that was a good strategy for preserving the digital content. However, what we found was that they were not equal, nor were they consistently not equal. It was random errors throughout, which made it very difficult. However, understanding the characteristics of digital audiovisual media that we learned in Part 1, and also understanding the archiving and preservation process that we just talked about, and things related to fixity checking, we were able to understand which files didn't match up with each other, and we were able to actually create a best effort restoration. So we used a lot of tools that were basic, free, and available, and we essentially identified the bit level differences between the two, and it identified the bad file sections and replaced it with the good file sections, so you'd actually have a whole file by the end of that restoration process. So it's important to understand some of these basics of archiving and preservation and the file characteristics and what you're supposed to expect. So let's move on to considerations for audiovisual material when we're talking about archiving and preservation systems and policies. At a top level, there are many challenges, and not only challenges with archival special collections, but also subscription service collections where you might be acquiring digital media that you need to host at your library or make available to your users digitally without the mediation of a distributor. So there's always the question of when is it appropriate to subscribe to a system or to actually take it into your library yourself. Other things related to the carriers and the file readability, licensing considerations that relate to the kind of rights management metadata that we'll talk about. Management becomes an issue when you're talking about digital storage space. This is an issue that everyone contends with, and in the realm of audiovisual media, it can become very, very difficult. Repository infrastructure, metadata that we talked about, integration with other systems, let's say, for instance, your course reserve systems or other systems for access. And we're always challenged by format obsolescence. We're always challenged by access control and digital streaming and the whole preservation process as a whole. So essentially, digitization is key to the survival of your analog materials. Migration is key to the survival of your born digital materials, where migration is actually sometimes the transcoding of one file to another, or the migration of a physical media to a digital domain. Master files should be archived and preserved, and access files should be used for production purposes and user access. So a typical workflow in audiovisual preservation is to create a master file, create a mezzanine file, which is sort of an intermediary that's not as high resolution and not as big as your archived master file, that you can use within your systems to create derivatives or to use in a production context, depending on whatever you have to do. So how do I choose a format? Essentially, you want to consider your workflows, your infrastructure, and the needs that will influence how you pick. I'm not going to drill down into specific characteristics as I did in the first part of the webinar series, but here's some takeaways. Make sure that your format's non-proprietary and it's as open as possible. Like I said earlier, what works in your institution in terms of perhaps the size of your institution and ease of use in your institution. Can the file be transcoded easily for future migrations? This is the concept of if a file format can't be supported in your environment anymore, it does need to be transcoded so that it can be supported in the future. And you also want to consider the least amount of software and hardware dependencies. So I referred to this idea of sustainability. The Library of Congress has a sustainability of digital formats page where you can actually drill down into a variety of different file formats and codecs and wrappers to understand, in the context of sustainability, what is a certain file's adoption? Is it transparent enough that there aren't barriers to understanding the file in your systems? What kind of external dependencies there are? What kind of impacts there are to perhaps patents? So we're talking about proprietary file formats. This is a great resource when you're considering what files will be sustainable in your environment. So let's just talk about quickly some common wrappers and codecs for video preservation, some common formats for access, and some common wrappers and formats for film preservation. So in the first part of the webinar series, we talked about wrappers, what they are, how they can be used. In a preservation context for audiovisual material, you're going to see these more so than others. QuickTime, which are MOV files, AVI, which is audio video interleaved, and Matroska, which has the extension MKV. Matroska is a file wrapper that is pretty advanced and contain a lot of different essences and a lot of different metadata that makes managing files more easy over time, because you can embed metadata. You can make your files more usable by having subtitle tracks in your systems. And all of these wrapper formats can contain different types of codecs. The two that you'll see most in a video preservation context are the V21 uncompressed codec or a lossless codec called FFV1. The main difference between lossless and uncompressed is that lossless files essentially have a way of reorganizing information to reduce the file size, but when played back or unpacked, you get back to the original information without losing anything. So in compression, you actually lose information, which is considered lossy. So another file format you might be familiar with is DV. That's typically used as a mezzanine file that's used in production purposes and used to make derivatives. But in a preservation context, we want to go with either uncompressed or lossless files. Common format for access would be an MP4. That's widely used across many different systems. They can be very small files with very good compression. Great for access. And within the film preservation realm, you have 2K to 4K DPX sequences, which essentially are file image sequences where a scanner will take a scan of each frame, and that will be considered your archival master, and then you'd have a conformed audio and video into a video wrapper, let's say like QuickTime or AVI. So I'm not going to drill down, considering time, I'm not going to drill down into each aspect of these examples, but you're going to get the slides. So this is an example of file format and file properties that you might see for digitizing analog video sources in an uncompressed manner. Things to take note of are the frame size, aspect ratio, the color space, frame rate, whether it's interlaced or progressive, and all of the decisions you make when selecting your file format, and these specific options relate to what was the source, because the idea is to get as close to the source as possible. But what about in a digital video source or a born digital context? We talked a little bit about file normalization. I think the rule of thumb here when you're dealing with born digital media is to keep it in its native format so long as you can preserve it and that it can be sustainable for access. However, if you do need to normalize files, then you'll have to decide what's the best file format and codec to transcode something to in order to make it sustainable, and the sustainability factors in the Library of Congress website helps a lot with that. Another important aspect when planning for preservation is file size, and so when you're dealing with digital files, you're dealing with large storage requirements. So for example, in the SD, HD, and 2K realm, you can see an hour's worth of material can be anywhere from 100 gigs to 1.1 terabytes. And that becomes astronomical when you're dealing with large collections that you're actually digitizing and preserving. Other considerations include metadata, descriptive, technical, and preservation. So when we're talking about technical, we're talking about file properties, and in a preservation context, we're talking about administrative metadata, rights, and let's think premise, how we can track events that happen to a digital file over time so we understand its provenance and its authenticity, and some different standards that you might want to consider. Dublin Core for very basic descriptive information, PB Core, which will incorporate all aspects of the descriptive, technical, and preservation metadata, as well as EVU core. These are all used in an audiovisual media preservation context. So I'll just briefly talk a little bit about some of the projects that we've done here at UC San Diego. We have a large VHS collection, approximately 6,500 titles, and they're all prone to physical deterioration, poor video quality, obsolescence, dwindling circulation, all of the things that we covered in part 1 of the webinar series. And so what we wanted to do was we wanted to replace titles that were being used with commercial versions, but the things that were out of print, we needed to figure out what we wanted to do with them. And so essentially what we decided upon was to take advantage of our rights as a library. So here, we're afforded the opportunity to digitize published VHS tapes due to the limitations on exclusive rights, reproduction by libraries and archives. This section also allows libraries to make copies for preservation purposes. So essentially, what we did was we have to do a scan of the VHS collections to see what is commercially available and what is not. So if it's out of print, we can digitize and make copies. We also wanted to be cognizant of closed captioning, and essentially what we did was we would digitize the VHS tapes into an uncompressed fashion file format. We're going to decide whether we're going to preserve them losslessly or preserve them uncompressed. But we also ended up making DVD video copies because our users actually preferred having physical discs. We're talking specifically faculty, because they like to put things on reserve, and they like to also have the discs that they could take home and use. So that's always going to be a question, whether or not you want to create physical media out of digital surrogates. And in some cases, it's the right thing to do. In some cases, it's not the right thing to do. And that's up to you, to your individual institution. So another kind of born digital example is our relationship with the University of California Television, which produces content at our library. Specifically, I'm just going to roll through some of these slides here because we're running out of time, but they have their own access platform to watch video content. However, at the library, we've been hosting Holocaust Living History workshops where UCTV comes to our library, records those events. And because there are events here, we want to preserve them in our repository. So what we do is essentially a born digital workflow where the content producers create the files, give it to us, and we work with them to make them ready to be ingested into our digital repository that you can see here as an example. So essentially, we wanted to manage and preserve those files. Before, they were on local hard drives. They were not sufficiently described, and they were not committed to any preservation storage. And we wanted our access management system to be the primary access copy for the content. So essentially, following the principles of the digital archiving and preservation process, we assessed technical specifications for the files, and we developed a metadata input form so that we can track all the essential fields that we need to, ingest them into our repository and manage them that way. And going back to this idea of the open archival information system and how it's important to pay attention to the archiving and preservation process at the point of preservation or at the point of acquisition, we want to accept the files from the producer and ensure that they are masters. So we have to work with them closely to make sure that they conform to our requirements, create mezzanine masters, and describe content through our metadata creation. We found that we really do need to work closely with acquisitions people and also the people producing the content to make sure those files conform to baseline standards and that we can do a rights review on this kind of material. So just want to conclude before we can get into the question and answer period. So AV media preservation in the digital domain requires knowledge of analog originals, files generated through the digitization process, and files acquired through born digital means. And the archiving preservation process is part of a larger kind of system that incorporates people, policies, and technology, and decisions must be made based on available resources and what makes sense for an individual institution. So this concludes the part 2 of the webinar series that complemented our deep dive into audiovisual files. So I'm ready to take any questions that you might have and have a discussion.
Thank you, Stefan. That was a lot of information in a short time. We now have time for questions, and if you've not yet done so, please type your questions into the question box. And the first question we have is, are you routinely creating 508 access derivatives for your VHS collection? Or do you have a project for that?
So yes, we are actively creating digital surrogates for collections that we cannot replace commercially. So for those things that we can replace commercially, we're actually buying updated formats. And for those things out of print, we're digitizing them and making DVD copies for loan and preserving the digital files as masters because we consider them to be unique.
Okay. Do you use outsourcing for any of your digitization?
We do not. Well, we have before, and that was when we were experimenting with the extraction of closed captioning content. So some VHS tapes will have closed captioning information in one of the lines of the video. And we did an initial pilot where we sent out videos to a vendor to see what kind of closed captioning information we can get from them, and then kind of tested our own workflows here. But you can achieve digitizing at your institution with a minimal viable workstation. You essentially need a video deck, you need an AD converter, and you need software to capture it. And if you were in the first part of the series, we talked about what a station like that is comprised of and how to digitize materials. So those slides will be available, I think, 6 months from now for those who weren't present at the first webinar.
Right. If you had signed up for the first one, you should have already gotten those slides, and it did have a discussion of the setup. Another question we had is, what is some recommended preservation file formats specifically for audio files? What do you like to keep?
For audio files, essentially an uncompressed PCM, which is in WAV format, and more specifically broadcast WAV format. And the reason why broadcast WAV format is a preferred format is because it has the ability to embed descriptive metadata and other preservation-related metadata about how the file was created. And so in that context, when you're creating digital files, you have considerations about bit rate and sampling rate. For audio, in a preservation context, you're talking about 96 kilohertz sampling rate and 24-bit. That is probably the highest that you would want to do for audio preservation, and you can make decisions as to whether or not you want to go lower than that, because you might want to save storage space. So CD audio quality is 44.1 kilohertz and 16-bit. A lot of the time that's sufficient for spoken word material, but the WAV format, and more specifically broadcast WAV format, is preferred, and that's the codec is PCM, uncompressed.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned, and we talked about this a little bit in the first presentation, that it's important to keep the original file after digitizing, or if you're changing file formats. Is this also true if it's corrupt or it's in a file format that you and your institution cannot access?
So I'm going to interpret this question to be kind of looking at born digital material.
Probably.
So if,
now that you say that,
if the file is corrupt and you have a mandate to preserve it, I would expect that you'd want to preserve it, not necessarily just because there's a mandate, but there's always the possibility that a file that's corrupt can be fixed somehow. And you might want to weigh the cost-benefit analysis of keeping that file format now, and whatever resources it takes to maintain its storage space and management and whatnot, and saving it for a time where perhaps you can fix it. And a format you can't access can be due to might not have the right software to open it, or in the media context, you might not have the right codec to play it back. Those things you can find. And you might even want to consider the concept of transcoding the file to see if you can actually transcode it to something else that maybe you can play it back. So those are some considerations. But you know, if you're talking about an original file that's also a unique primary document, I would suggest keeping it. And in a management context, I would suggest making notes in your metadata about whether it's corrupt or how you might think it's corrupt, so that you can tend to it in the future when perhaps there's technology that can access it.
Okay, and that's a good idea. I like the idea of having it as a note, so that maybe somebody in the future has more information or more access to software than you do. I think if nobody else has any other questions, I don't see any more that have come in. We'll go ahead and thank Stefan for presenting, and we want to thank everybody else for coming today. We're glad you could be with us today. You will soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions. Your comments are very valuable to us, and they help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee plan future events. The email will also include links to today's slides and the recording. You now also have the opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance, and that information will also be in the email. I want to thank our presenter again, Stefan El-Nabli, and thank you also to members of the Continuing Education Committee, Felicity Dykes, Joseph Nicholson, Amal Morsi, and to Alana Warren from the ALCTS office. The support they provide make it possible for us to present these webinars. ALCTS has other continuing education opportunities coming up. We have several more webinars this spring, including writing and publishing research results, the Library of Congress bid frame progress, and looking forward in April, we have 2 free webinars as part of the Preservation Week celebration, Preserving Your Family History and Caring for Family Keepsakes. See the ALCTS webinar to register or to find more information on these events. ALCTS also offers web courses, which are 4 to 6 weeks long, as well as 2-day email discussions. Our next e-forum will be on March 19th on knowledge-based management. Please check the website for information on upcoming courses and discussions. Thank you all for joining us today, and this concludes our session.